That was a lovely introduction, and it's also great to be here. I think this is a really fascinating ambition and endeavour that you put together, and an excellent lineup of speakers. I have to confess the ambition to explain art and aesthetics in predictive processing terms is a very high-end ambition and aim. So just to acknowledge that, I'm sure that's going to come out in the panel discussions, and already came out to a certain extent yesterday. In response to that sort of distant dream, I'm going to balance it by going back to basics. So I thought my role would be just to unpack the physics of sentience, the formal basis of Bayesian mechanics. Just do that intuitively. I'm aware that much of the audience probably is not fluent with maths, but I would like to try and give the intuition as to the principles that underlie predictive processing and active inference, simply because if you can take current formulations of predictive processing and link them convincingly to art and aesthetics, you then have a seamless connection right back to the basic physics of self-organization and sentience, which strikes me as a very laudable aim and accomplishment. So I'm going to talk. We are on. My talk's going to have sort of 3 bits to it, and unlike Sanders, I haven't had the forethought to record this in advance to make sure that I finish on time. So I'm going to rely on Jacopo to stop me a few minutes before my 40 to 45 minutes, and I'll just rush through the slides that we didn't have time to cover. The talk will have 3 bits to it. I'm first of all going to tell the story of self-organization and physics, and with a particular focus on Bayesian mechanics from the perspective of a physicist. I'm then going to rehearse exactly the same story, but using the concepts and rhetoric that you'd find in cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, and neuroscience, with a specific focus on predictive coding and neuronal networks. And then I want to conclude with a special treatment of active inference and epistemic affordance, which I think is particularly pertinent to the issues that you're contending with. So I generally start the physics part, the first half of this presentation, with a question posed by Schrödinger. How can the events in space and time which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism be accounted for by physics and chemistry? And we're not going to try and answer that question, but what I want to do is to pick up on the notion of a spatial boundary and how important that is in terms of trying to separate states that belong to something versus states that are not part of that thing. And that in that separation, we will find emerges the kind of mechanics that we need to understand and exchange with the external milieu, or what's outside our skulls. So Schrödinger would be the first person to acknowledge that this boundary is in and of itself a statistical process. And I'm going to read that as something called a Markov boundary or a Markov blanket. At this point, I would normally ask the audience to tell, or if anybody in the audience knows what a Markov blanket is, and then get them to explain it to their friends. But I don't have that opportunity, so I'll just run through what I think you need to know in terms of what a Markov blanket is. In essence, it's a statistical boundary, best illustrated if we imagine that there is some universe represented here in terms of this graph, where the nodes are states of some universe or some world. And if I identify a certain set of states, and I'll call those internal states, going to be internal to some particle or person or a plant, then the Markov blanket comprises the parents, the children, and the parents of the children. And this set of states plays an important role in the following sense: that if I wanted to know about, say, my states, my internal states, and how they're going to evolve, I only need to know the blanket states, in the sense that knowing the external states adds no extra information. So if you like, these blanket states provide an insulation or a veil or a statistical blanket that enshrouds my internal states and contain all the necessary information in the rest of the universe that would be useful in terms of predicting my states and how they are evolving in the moment. And I'm going to make a further move. I'm going to split the blanket states into two sets. One where the sensory states influence but are not influenced by internal states, and another active set of states that influence but are not influenced by external states. And I'll motivate that by partition in the next slide. So what we've got is essentially a partition into internal and external states and states that separate these two. And we refer to those as blanket states. And I can consider the collection of blanket states and their internal states as the states of a particle, but I mean a very general particle that could be, in fact, me or you. So here are a couple of illustrations of this partition of states of a universe along the lines that would be familiar to people in the neurosciences or in cellular biology. So for example, we can take the internal states for a person to be associated with the states of the brain. So being able to list every aspect of brain function that would completely describe the internal state of my brain at any moment in time. The active states would be my actuators, my autonomic reflexes, my muscles that change external states, things out there that in turn reciprocate by providing sensory impressions that in turn influence the internal states, thereby completing a cycle or circular causality, an exchange between the inside and the outside, mediated in both directions by blanket states, influences of the outside and the inside by the sensory states, and correspondingly influences of the inside on the outside by the active states. And this influence diagram is predicated on that conditional independence that is defined by the Markov blanket and emerges wherever you look. When as soon as you're talking about anything or any particle, you find this organization. So for example, in a single-celled organism, we can look at the internal states as being intracellular states, the active states, say the actin filaments that support the cell's surface and afford it motility, influencing the external milieu, which reciprocates by affecting cell surface sensory states that influence the intracellular states. Exactly the same circular exchange, if you like, a perception action cycle articulated in terms of this particular partition or a partition that defines a particle or a thing. What I want you to do now is forget about this particular partition and the Markov blanket. What we're going to do now is rehearse all of physics in about four minutes. The aim being to then replace the Markov blankets in the context of the fundamentals of self-organization in physics and see what special properties things have under the rules that govern self-organization of any dynamic system. So what I've done here is sketch out two states of any universe, state one, state two here, as they trace out their different states in trajectories or paths over time. The states are X, they flow through this state space here, they're subject to random fluctuations here. So you could think of this at many different scales in space and time. For example, it could be the fluctuations in all of my neurons in terms of its electrical potential over a time scale of, say, a few hundred or even less milliseconds. It could be the beating of my heart during the cardiac cycle, or it could be me getting up in the morning, having a cup of coffee, doing my emails and so on, going through my life, my daily cycle. It could be an annual cycle, it could be a life cycle. The key thing is, at all these different levels of description, the states which I occupy are a very limited set of states that I could occupy. And it is those states that define the kind of thing that I am. They define me. And that's the key aspect that is going to be, if you like, leveraged in order to understand the role of the Markov blanket. But before we do that, we have to understand what are the basic laws that govern the evolution or the flow through this subset of attracting states, this technically speaking, a pullback attractor. Well, one way of understanding this is to think about the density of these trajectories as a likelihood of you finding me in this particular state at any point in time if I was sampled at random. And from physics, we know exactly how this probability distribution evolves as a function of the flow, the probability density, and the amplitude of the random fluctuations. It's known as the Fokker-Planck equation. You may have come across it as a master equation or the Schrödinger wave equation. All we need to know is that this is physics. And furthermore, the application of this equation is made much more simple in virtue of the fact that we are only interested in those systems that restrict themselves to a particular number of states that define the system in question, which means we know this probability density is not changing. So this rate of change, the dot here, is 0, which enables me to rewrite the solution to this equation in terms of the flow that can now be expressed as what's called a gradient flow, like walking downhill or water flowing down a valley, where the altitude or the potential, the height of the valley is given by the log of the probability of occupying any state, or the negative log of the probability of occupying any state. In other words, I'm flowing towards those states which characterize me. This has got two parts to it, this gradient flow, that I'll unpack for you in the next slide more intuitively. Imagine that I place a drop of ink in a glass of water. Now, for systems that don't have this characteristic set of attracting states, the ink molecules will be subject to random perturbations, fluctuations of a molecular sort, and they will disperse throughout the solvent. And this will be in accord with the second law of thermodynamics. And this is not the kind of system that we're interested in. We're interested in describing the behavior of systems like you and me, that, if you like, gather themselves together so that they look as if they're occupying a restricted number of states. And if that's the case, then it is almost intuitive, but certainly easy to prove mathematically, that their flow must be countering the dispersion due to the random fluctuations. And furthermore, you can decompose that flow into two orthogonal or at right angles parts. So I've cartooned that here in terms of the flow towards, if you like, paradoxically up concentration gradients that counter the dispersive and dissipating effects of random fluctuations. And this is the bit that depends upon the amplitude of the random fluctuations. And then there's a circular flow on the isocontours of this log probability that is referred to as solenoidal flow. And we'll all be familiar with these two kinds of flows everywhere you look, whether it's oscillations in the brain or whether it's the circular motion of the heavenly bodies in the planetary system, or in this instance, looking at the water flowing down your bathtub, your bathhole. So one can imagine these two components as being manifest by the circular flow as the water flows down the plug hole, and the gradient flow is a flowing down these potential gradients given by this negative log probability. So that's basic physics. From that I can spin off quantum electrodynamics, classical physics, thermodynamics, but the special kind of physics we want to talk about is that ensues or inherits from the presence of a Markov blanket. So here's our fundamental Hill gradient flow here on some quantity, and that this flow also, the form of that flow, pertains to the partition. So it pertains to my internal states, I'm denoting by mu here, and my active states. And the story I'm going to tell is that this describes perception and action respectively, and I'm going to validate that story just by reference to a whole range of normative theories of sentient behavior and self-organization in the in the neurosciences and indeed beyond. So let's just think about how we might interpret. What would it look like if a system is always trying to flow in a way that looks as though it's maximizing this log probability? Well, it would look as if it was always trying to maximize the value of the states in question, in this instance, say, the blanket states. And from that, we can interpret this log probability of the kinds of states, or certainly the blanket states, that characterize me, the ones that I occupy, that I find attractive, as simply value. And from that, we can interpret these equations of motion here in terms of reinforcement learning, optimal control theory, and economics expected utility theory. This is nice because the negative of this value, or this formulation of value, also has a very particular meaning in information theory. It's known as self-information, sometimes known as surprisal, or more simply surprise. And in fact, it's going to be the quantity that we associate with free energy, which we're going to unpack later. So what that means is everything that exists in the sense of possessing these attracting set of states must look as though they're trying to minimize surprise. And from this, we can derive information theoretic descriptions of optimal behavior in terms of the principle of maximum mutual information, or minimum redundancy principles, and indeed the free energy principle. In turn, the time average of surprise in physics is known as entropy. So it looks as if these dynamics, these equations of motion, this gradient flow, looks as if it's trying to minimize, on average over time, entropy. And of course, that's the holy grail of self-organization as formalized in terms of things like synergetics by Hermann Haken. And of course, if I was a physiologist, it's just a statement of homeostasis. It's just a statement that I'm keeping certain states within physiological bounds by minimizing their dispersion. And there's a final interpretation of this quantity here, this surprise, from the point of view of a statistician. And if I swap now M, which hitherto has meant me as a system, or a Markov blanket, and now treat the Markov blanket, or the particle implicit in the Markov blanket, as a model of the blanket states that are recording the impressions of the external states, then I can interpret this quantity as Bayesian model evidence, which makes it which lends an interpretation to this fundamental gradient flow as aspiring to maximize model evidence. And from this, you can derive the Bayesian brain hypothesis, evidence accumulation, and indeed predictive coding. More poetically, we can describe this as self-evidencing, or summarize this kind of action and perception as self-evidencing. So that's all the heavy lifting from the point of view of physics. Always said that the existence of a particle implies a partition of a system's states into internal blanket, namely sensory and active, and external states that are hidden behind the Markov blanket from the point of view of the internal states, or what's inside our skulls. And because active states change but are not changed by external states, they appear to reduce the entropy of blanket states. And this means that action will look as if it's trying to maintain the structural and functional integrity of the Markov blanket. And in the life sciences, that's sometimes been referred to as autopoiesis, or self-creation. In computational chemistry, this would be self-assembly. Internal states appear to infer the hidden causes of sensory states by maximizing Bayesian model evidence, and actively influence those causes. And we generally refer to that as active inference. There's another story here, which I won't go on to, which appeals to sort of representationalism and information geometries, but that's a bit more philosophical. So this is a light interlude. I had a student who worked with us, did some wonderful work on pattern formation at the cellular level, and then went to work with Mike Levin at Tufts. And then shortly after arriving, he and his partner had their first baby, little Kira, and his wife bought little Kira a Markov blanket. So this is Markov on the blanket, with little Kira making her inferences about the world through her blanket. So if you want a Markov blanket, you can get them in America and where else. So that's the physics story. What I'm going to do now is effectively tell exactly the same story, but using the constructs and concepts that emerge from neurobiology and slightly beyond. So I think beautifully illustrated by this 16th century oil painter, famed for doing still lives, that when viewed from a different perspective, give you a very different percept, a very different hypothesis about what could have caused these sensory impressions. And I think that captures the idea here, which you can trace from Plato through to Kant, through Helmholtz, through to Richard Gregory, and so on and so on, and through to you, in fact. The idea being that the brain is in the game of actively constructing explanations, fantasies, hypotheses that best explain the sensory evidence at hand. So this is very much an inside-out perspective on perception, which contrasts with the more 20th century outside-in extracting information from sensory streams. Here, the sensations are just in the service, providing evidence for or against some particular hypothesis. So if previously you saw a bowl of fruit and now you see a face, the key point is that you made that face. You could not have perceived that face unless it was already on the inside as a putative explanation for why you're seeing this pattern of sensory input. So this notion, I think, is an enduring notion over the millennia. I think most beautifully articulated by Helmholtz. For example, objects are always imagined as being present in the field of vision, as would have to be there in order to produce the same impression on the nervous mechanism. So again, what he's saying is you have to have something on the inside that could have caused the same sensations that you're actually encountering in order to perceive. And the spirit of that argument is, of course, formally identical to Richard Gregory's notion of perception as a hypothesis testing. These notions have been used to great effect in machine learning. For example, people like Geoffrey Hinton and Peter Dayan have engineered a Helmholtz machine in honor of Helmholtz as a metaphor for how the Bayesian brain might work by borrowing from probability theory, Bayesian probability theory, and in particular, the work of Richard Feynman on making Bayesian inference tractable via the free energy, or a variation of free energy. I want to focus though on Helmholtz's notion of impressions on the nervous system, because that fits very comfortably with the external states impressing themselves upon the sensory veil afforded by the blanket states. And if this sort of Bayesian interpretation of this fundamental gradient flow, this autopoiesis, is correct, what it means is it'll look as if on the inside we are trying to produce the best explanation for this shadow on our sensory veils. In other words, infer or guess at what caused that. And you may be asking, well, how do we do that? Well, the answer from the physicist's point of view is if you exist, you are by definition doing that. And you're doing that in a way that the physicist would say, this is how it works. So for example, if I now write that gradient flow with the solenoidal bit and the part that does the gradient flow, the gathering together of states at probability gradients, or in this instance, down free energy gradients, in terms of the random fluctuations, I know how my internal states will change with time. That's what the dot means here. So here's this gradient flow expressed in terms of a gradient on the free energy, which, if you remember, is equal to the surprise. I'm just going to rewrite these two components of the flow in terms of something called a prediction and an update. And I'm doing that in the fond hope that there's one person in the audience that will recognize this as something called a Kalman filter, a generic, widely used scheme in engineering to infer the states of something you need to usually control on the basis of your beliefs about the current state of the system and how it will change in the immediate future. This is what this solenoidal part means, the prediction part, that is nuanced. It's updated by a prediction error. And mathematically, you can always write down a free energy gradient as a prediction error. But intuitively, what is a prediction error? Well, imagine I had this sensory impression, this shadow on my sensory veil, and I had some internal state that I now read as an expectation of what caused that sensory impression. And I might encode or represent or believe that it was a dog. And if I had a generative model which was able to generate what I would have seen if there was indeed a dog out there, then I can take my prediction generated by my generative model and subtract it from the actual sensory impression to produce a prediction error. And then I can use the prediction error to drive my internal states to reduce the prediction error. And that's basically all this equation is saying. It's saying that self-organizing systems that must possess these or this kind of dynamics will look as if they're using their prediction errors to find better explanations for their sensorium or the causes of their sensorium. That by better, it's simply minimizing prediction errors or free energy. It doesn't mean to say you'll ever know what's out there. It could have been something else very different, but that doesn't matter, provided you minimize your prediction errors for as long as you live. Job done. That's all that we need to do. That's a pleasing and simple perspective on existential imperatives. So we can forget about all the physics and now just say, well, to exist simply means to minimize prediction error. So what would that look like? Well, there are two ways of minimizing prediction error. We can either change our mind, change our internal brain states, for example, to supply or generate predictions that are more like the sensations at hand. We can regard that as perception. Or we can change the sensations by actively resampling or palpating the world to make them more like the predictions. And we can look at that in terms of action. Basically, action fulfilling and actively sampling, visually palpating or tactilely palpating or attending to certain sensory streams in a way that makes them conform to our top-down predictions. And for those of you who, so I noted in the discussion yesterday that there was some concern about the biological plausibility of predictive coding of a hierarchical sort that entails quite abstract representations that have these deep structures, these deep narratives. In fact, there's quite a lot known about it, and all the evidence to date suggests this is probably an apt description of perception as implemented in terms of neuronal dynamics, which are now read as this gradient flow. So I've just written the gradient flow here again, but now interpreting the internal states as neural activity under some generative model that's generating these predictions of the sensory input. So here are how the sensory impressions are actually generated by some hidden causes out there beyond my skull, beyond my Markov blanket, equipped with their random fluctuations. And then inside my head, I have exactly the same hierarchical architecture, but now the internal states come to represent or provide best guesses about those external causes, and the random fluctuations are now replaced by the free energy gradients or the prediction error. So this is the kind of architecture that you'd expect. I've sort of given you a particular example here of the kind of generative model that is reflected in the architectures we see in the brain, illustrated here in terms of, if I wanted to generate either predictions or say synthetic foveal retinal samples, I'd need to know what I was looking at, and I'd need to know where I was looking and how I was palpating that particular object. And then I could cascade down through this deep generative model that will be very dynamic and nonlinear to actually generate visual impressions that are impressed upon my retina. And what this scheme does, it goes the other way. It gets you from the sensory fluctuations back to an abstract representation or best explanation, the hypothesis that is the best or most apt to explain these sensory this sensory input with the minimum of prediction error. So you can see how one can, from this simple equation, under a hierarchical structure of the way that sensations are generated, arrive at a scheme where you've got deep representations that are all internally consistent and updated formally via a process of Bayesian belief updating by a counter stream that comprises descending predictions and ascending prediction errors, very much along the lines that we understand reciprocal or recurrent message passing among levels of cortical hierarchies, certainly in the human brain and in most other brains. Just a note about these functional architectures, because they're really interesting. They tell you about the causal structure of the world. It's not just the depth that is important, but as illustrated by this factorization or carving nature at its joints into conditionally independent causes, there's also a lot of interesting structure in terms of the factorial breadth of the generative models that we suppose, or one supposes, that the brain uses to make its guesses. Here's a beautiful picture on your website. I couldn't resist putting that in. So you've got this little hierarchy here, all in the right colors, which is very pleasing. So this is just a schematic that tells you about the exchange between these prediction error encoding neural populations and the expectations denoted by mu here. Here's my rendition, just to very briefly take you through this. Again, no, you don't need to remember any of this, but if you're not in neurobiology, you can rest assured that it's very simple and it looks very much like real neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. So in this example, we've got some visual impressions coming in from the eyes. They go to a deep brain nucleus, the LGN, and they're in receipt of these top-down predictions from the part of the brain responsible for predicting this low-level visual input to form a prediction error. That prediction error is then sent forward to update the expectations, to eliminate and suppress or resolve the prediction errors, to form better expectations about edges and orientations and velocities and the like at a very low level. But of course, these expectations are also being predicted by high-level expectations, so that you can form second-order prediction errors that are then sent up to update and improve our representations at a higher level, and so on to any arbitrary depth. The reason I'm taking you through this sort of visual example is that I just want to highlight the important role of action and the very simple role of action. And I'll do that by noting that there are other kinds of input which have to be assimilated within these hierarchical models. So inputs from my eye muscles that tell me where my eye is pointing. And I might have top-down predictions about where my eye is pointing, and they would form a prediction error, and I could change my mind about where I think my eye is pointing. But there's another way in which we can suppress these prediction errors, and that's by returning them back to the outside world to cause actively stretching or contraction of the muscles until they supply the predicted top-down input. And this is just a classical reflex arc. So this is the action. It's much simpler than you might imagine. It is basically fulfilling top-down predictions of the way I would expect myself to move in this context, that itself is deeply informed by this deep hierarchical message passing and hierarchical predictive processing. So I'll close now if I have time, and I haven't been stopped yet, so that's good. I daren't look at the clock. So what I want to do now is just close by just rethinking the action bit, because that notion of action as reflexively fulfilling top-down predictions about how I'd feel my body moving, palpating the world at this moment in time is a very fine and certainly tenable explanation for a lot of our action. You can take this particular formulation of active inference quite a long way, and this is a nice example where we've equipped a synthetic agent with a generative model in which she thinks that there's some sort of abstract pattern, some cycle, mathematically a heteroclinic cycle going on. And what this does is it moves a hidden, invisible point in the outside world, and her finger is attached by a spring to this invisible point. So she believes the universe is basically built out of an invisible point that's pulling her finger around. Now, because she believes that, she's going to generate predictions that action now will fulfill. So this agent is creating her own reality, if you like, her own sensorium, and drawing, in this instance, writing a couple of letters, simply by realizing top-down predictions of a dynamical sort through the active reflexes, and in so doing, generating the visual impressions that she predicted, because this generative model is generating both the proprioceptive predictions and the visual predictions. And one can produce very realistic and robust sort of artistic behavior of a very elemental sort, using this implementation of active inference. You can even go further and note that because you've got this amodal generative model, this sort of high-level abstraction of what dynamic, what narrative is in play, you can remove the proprioceptive prediction errors and just replay the visual information. So it's as if someone else is doing the drawing or causing the visual consequences of drawing, and you can tell all sorts of stories about the same neurons encoding both the self-produced action, the creative part, but also when you're watching somebody else, you can just ignore the fact you're not getting the proprioceptive predictions and use exactly the same neural machinery, predictive processing, and neurons in the spirit of mirror neurons to explain the behavior, observable behavior of other people, and thereby infer what they were up to. So here's a little schematic just showing you the functional architecture, the mathematical architecture on which that simulation was based. We have sensory inputs coming in onto the sensory states of our Markov blanket. They are, through that fundamental gradient flow, they look as if they're minimizing their surprise or prediction error or free energy to perform expectations or technically Bayesian beliefs about external states of the world out there that can be decomposed in a way I'll cover in the next slide. And once we've done that, we also have now beliefs about how we are going to act that minimize those prediction errors or destroy those free energy gradients, that supply the motor commands for our reflexes, that fulfill the expectations and provide the kinds of sensations that we expect, and everything works very nicely. However, I don't think that kind of active inference is really going to hack it in terms of understanding R, because nothing here entails a generative model of me as agent doing stuff or acting upon the world. It is just like a glorified thermostat. So what other ways could one elaborate the generative model in order to explain the behavior of particles, namely people and certain creatures, that look as if they have the ability to plan? And this is very simple to do. All you do is you equip the generative model with the consequences of action. And in so doing, you will have to identify the probability of one particular course of action with its propensity to minimize free energy, minimize surprise, minimize prediction error after acting. So now you have to evaluate the goodness of a particular course of action in terms of the free energy expected consequent upon the action. And that's all this remains the same, but all we're doing now is evaluating the expected free energy given a particular action, and then choosing the action that has the minimum expected free energy, sometimes known as planning as inference. There's a decomposition here, which I'm going to unpack on one of the last remaining slides. Again, you can switch off if you don't like maths, but I find this particularly beautiful piece of maths that enables you to put a teleology on this kind of planning and why. What are the imperatives for choosing this course of action, this visual palpation, listening to that musician, as opposed to another sensory stream? And they all inherits from this free energy version of surprise or prediction error. From a statistician's point of view, the free energy, or usually negative log model evidence, can always be split into two parts that define or prescribe the best explanations are those that provide an accurate explanation of the data at hand, the sensations S, that is as simple as possible, that minimizes the complexity. That's just a measure of the degree to which you change your mind in order to provide the accurate explanation. So if your prior beliefs are fit for purpose, you won't have to change your mind very much, and you'll have minimum complexity. If you were from machine learning, you'd rearrange this equation and you'd understand it as an evidence bound on the log of the evidence, the Bayesian model evidence given inherent in some data. Given a model, this is known as an elbow, an evidence lower bound machine learning. The reason I'm unpacking or carving this this imperative, this functional into two, is that the same duality, the same split, is inherited when we think about the expected free energy in terms of what would happen if I did that. And what happens is that the complexity becomes risk and the accuracy, or the negative accuracy, becomes ambiguity, which means that we can understand the imperatives for the ways that we choose to sample our world and engage with our sensorium in terms of this these two different imperatives, which can be rearranged in terms of the bound and the evidence to look like something called intrinsic value and extrinsic value. And I'll just very briefly, and I am going to race, like I'm sure I'm running out of time, just illustrate what these things mean, what they're in terms of their teleology in relation to existing theories of brain function. So if I just consider these two terms here and ignore this, what will become an extrinsic value, this term here is something in the visual search literature known as Bayesian surprise, and it just scores the information gain. In robotics, it would be the intrinsic motivation. It's the degree to which I reduce my uncertainty if I could get the information that was over there, if I looked over there. That's also the mutual information between the sensory consequences of some external causes that will be disclosed if I did that. I can take a certain amount of uncertainty off the table and remove the ambiguity and imagine that I can see magically all the external states on my sensory veil. That just leaves the expected complexity or the risk. So this speaks to the pragmatic part that we were hearing about yesterday of the good expected free energy minimizing actions. And this in engineering is known as KL control. In economics, it's known as risk sensitive control. And all it means is I'm going to choose those actions whose consequences in terms of either external sensed external states are as close as possible to the prior beliefs about the states that I occupy, my prior preferences. So there are two aspects there. I can even reduce this to expected utility theory in economics by even removing that kind of uncertainty. So I'm just left with the extrinsic value, this notion that this surprise and the negative surprise just is value. It's the states that I bring about through acting that I prefer to encounter or expect myself to encounter. You can use this formalism with a special focus on the intrinsic value that reads as salience in the visual search literature, illustrated here by the information gain or the intrinsic value of looking here as opposed to over here when resolving uncertainty about what I'm looking at, in this instance, this particular bust here. And if we measure, it's easy to compute, the reduction in uncertainty and the information gain as a function of where I can look within this circle, we get these salience maps that do indeed attract eye movements and the visual palpation of any scene. We can simulate that, create another little synthetic agent here. This agent's universe is very simple. It could just be in three states. She could be looking at an upright face, a sideways face, or an upside down face, but she can only palpate the world with a limited foveal sampling, which means she has to choose very carefully where to look next that maximally disambiguates her hypotheses about what could be causing that. So this is responding, or this is the epistemic part of action selection and an active inference, where you are responding to epistemic affordances that depend upon your beliefs about what caused that. Cartooned here in terms of where she's looking with little films. Here, these are the sensory samples, every eye movement, these are the eye movements, the intrinsic value or the salience that notice changes with time as her beliefs are being updated. So what you don't know determines where it's best to look next. And we can see the shrinkage of uncertainty and the emergence of a confident hypothesis that she is looking at an upright face, which indeed she was, both within and between saccadic eye movements. So I'm going to give the last word to Helmholtz, who summarizes very neatly what I've just spent the past 10 minutes trying to say, that each movement we make by which we alter the appearance of objects should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we have understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us, that is, their existence in definite spatial relations. And with that, it only remains for me to thank those people whose ideas I've been talking about. And of course, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much indeed.